Hello and welcome back. I'm Tim Willoughby here with R&D member Ian Duke, and we are ready for our second set of quarterfinals here at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. We've already seen Finkel against Mengucci. We've already seen LSV against Shota Yasuoka, but now we have our second set of semifinals. We're going to head down to the feature match area where we're going to get a chance to see Brad Nelson against Steve Rubin and Seth Manfield against Luis Salvatto. Let's check it out. Hello and welcome to the second set of quarterfinals here at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. I'm Tim Willoughby along with R&D member Ian Duke, and we are going to get a chance to check out some more of these fantastic players in this top 8. First up, we're going to kick off with the match between that man right there, Brad Nelson, former Player of the Year, member of Team Eureka for this tournament, and really reaping the rewards there because the deck that they brought along, an absolute powerhouse in red-green goggle ramp. His opponent, Steve Rubin, with green-white tokens. An update on the kind of hardened scales decks that we saw from last season, but a very powerful set of additions, including the likes of Westvale Abbey. So the players kicking things off here, finishing higher in the Swiss. It is Brad Nelson that gets to start things off with a Magnetic Insight, immediately drawing a couple of cards at the cost of discarding a land. Now, Steve Rubin's deck, kind of the one that's going to be going on the offensive in the early game here, Ian. It's the one that's got lots of creatures, but Brad's deck fairly well set up to deal with lots of creatures, right?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, certainly Steve Rubin's deck is the aggro deck in the matchup, so to speak, but it's not aggressive in the sense that it's trying to deploy a lot of creatures and end the game very quickly on, say, turn 4 or 5. By aggressive, what his deck wants to do is sort of curve out with planeswalkers and get a really big board presence that's difficult for Brad's deck to deal with in a timely fashion. So we're probably not going to see this game end very quickly, but it could turn into a sort of a snowball type effect for Steve Rubin if things go his way.
So after his Thraben Inspector on turn 1, picks up a Gideon Ally of Zendikar from Oath of Nissa and finds a second Thraben Inspector. Now these Inspectors initially not looking too exciting, but there are lots of different ways of pumping creatures in Steve Rubin's deck, and at some point those creatures become a little bit tricky for Brad Nelson to deal with, at least with the front end of his Kozilek's returns.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, the core of Steve's deck is basically Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, and Gideon Ally of Zendikar. So he wants to see those cards early, and those are the cards that really reinforce the rest of his army and make cards like Thraben Inspector a lot more relevant than a 1/2 creature otherwise would be.
So there we do see Nissa, and she brings a plant token with her off her first activated ability from her Planeswalker effect. And at the moment, this kind of playing into the Kozilek's return that we know is in Brad Nelson's hand. I'm guessing he's going to wait until the first time that Steve tries to pump his team. But no.
No, he did actually go ahead and fire that off. And yeah, I think just making sure that Steve isn't able to sort of start building up that big board. Once Steve's creatures get above 2 toughness and he starts getting lots on the board and a diversity of threats in terms of multiple planeswalkers, that's when it's hard for Brad's deck to catch up. So I think Brad just wants to stay one step ahead of the game, continue making his land drops, and sort of eventually get up to things like Worldbreaker and big plays with, say, Pyromancer's Goggles and Fall of the Titans being his big haymakers in the end game.
And I suppose that getting Kozilek's return in the graveyard early on, really not something with too much downside, because there is the opportunity to get that second bounce on it, I suppose. When you cast a big creature, you are going to get a chance to get a much bigger Kozilek's return the second time around. And looking at Steve Rubin's hand here, kind of a glut of all the same spells, which isn't too bad for Dramoka's command, but 3 copies of Gideon Ally of Zendikar, possibly one more than he might really want.
Yeah, Steve's probably not thrilled to be clogged on so many copies of the same card, although Gideon is one of the centerpieces of his deck, one of the cards he wants to draw every single game, so he's at least happy that he has 1 copy here, and that's going to be his next move here in terms of assembling his game plan. Meanwhile, you know, Brad's deck just wants to, again, keep making its land drop, get up to those powerful plays. We do see a Worldbreaker in his hand that's capable of flashing back Kozilek's return from the graveyard, so to speak. You know, whenever you play a big creature, converted mana cost 7 or greater, it will return Kozilek's return from your graveyard for 5 damage.
Now we see a Traverse the Ulvenwald in Brad Nelson's hand. He doesn't currently have Delirium, but once he does reach that point, being able to fetch creatures potentially quite good for him in this matchup, in addition to the regular mana fixing that it offers, because he's got the likes of Dragonlord Otaka that's also quite good at cleaning up these messy board states.
Yeah, especially true since Dragonlord Otaka can damage planeswalkers with her Fire Breath enter the battlefield ability. And that's one of the best ways for Brad to clean up these problematic permanents like Gideon and Nissa.
Gideon and Nissa here doing good work between the two of them, making sure that Steve Rubin has a lot of tokens. Those Plot tokens are 0/1 creatures, so he's not going to be attacking in the early game with them, but as soon as he decides to shift gears and start pumping everybody, well, there's a lot of damage coming through.
And here comes that big World Breaker we were talking about before. Now, Brad has the option to bring back Kozilek's Return from the graveyard, does do so, exiling Kozilek's Return for 5 damage to each creature, takes care of all those tokens on Steve's side of the battlefield, but does leave him with Gideon and Nissa still in play.
And a third copy of Dromoka's Command there, the pickup for Steve Rubin. Alongside Stasis Snare, he's got plenty of ways of dealing with creatures in play, but Brad's deck, the only creatures it really presents are very sizable ones indeed. Stasis Snare will do the job. Dromoka's Command, well, that might be a little bit more ambitious in terms of getting it involved in a fight that you're going to win.
Yeah, the primary use of Dromoka's Command for Steve in this matchup is that preventing damage from an instant or sorcery. You know, Brad has all these red burn spells in his deck, so that's one of the really important uses that we might see it come up throughout this match.
It looks like with so many copies, though, he is keen to just get damage in where he can. He gets a fight with Gideon there. Gideon, of course, very happy to get involved in any kind of a rumble.
Yep, so
and then he rumbles in.
A +1/+1 counter from Nissa onto Gideon, plus a +1/+1 counter from Dromoka's Command, made Gideon into a 7/7 creature for the turn.
Yeah, a little confusing there because we do now have +1/+1 counters and loyalty counters on Gideon. Those two are very definitely not interchangeable. But I'm sure that Steve will be able to keep straight exactly which one's which. Typically, Gideon, not one that you're looking to ramp up to gigantic loyalty for a big ultimate anyway. Making that emblem comes at a very efficient cost indeed. So Brad Nelson's hand here, not exactly the most exciting that we've seen from the Goggles ramp deck. I mean, ramp decks in principle can have some gigantic spells to be able to cast at some point. Right now, though, he's kind of got all of his setup and none of his big finish. Drowned Temple, an interesting addition, though, to this Goggles ramp deck, working very nicely indeed, both with the likes of Magmatic Insight and so on. It's a card that can very happily be discarded and put back into play, but its interaction with World Breaker, particularly powerful. In the meantime here, Steve just sort of looking to press his advantage. Brad Nelson on just 10 life, and not too much work here for Steve Rubin left to do in order to take that 10 down to 0. We are going to be having 2 pre-sideboarded games before either player gets to reach to their extra 15 to change this matchup. And Steve Rubin here, in spite of starting down as the lower seed, seems to have the early advantage.
So Steve just thinking through what he wants to do with his Planeswalkers this turn. Looks like he did tick up Gideon to 6 loyalty. Again, that Gideon there has 6 loyalty counters and 2 +1/+1 counters on it, which will remain from turn to turn, even though he stops being a creature temporarily. So Gideon back to a 7/7 creature for the turn. Rumbles into the red zone here.
So Brad Nelson here, living off the top of his deck, going to have to find something pretty exciting because Planeswalker's not the easiest for him to deal with, and actually on 6 loyalty, even the likes of Dragon Lord Ataka is going to have to make a decision as to which Planeswalkers to deal with because too much loyalty to deal with in total there.
So this Gideon proving to be a huge problem for Brad. Not a card that his deck can answer that easily, especially now that it's grown to be a 7/7. So a card like World Breaker, for example, not able to block it profitably anymore. Looks like Brad just thinking through his options here, maybe at the end of Steve's turn.
So there we see that Drownyard Temple interaction, sacrifices it in order to get back World Breaker, then pays 3 mana in order to put the Drownyard Temple back into play again. Nice and efficient use of mana at the end of turn. But World Breaker on its own, not really going to be enough to keep him in this game.
So one key thing here is that World Breaker has been attacking Steve's white mana. We can see Steve's hand there has a Stasis Snare in it, as well as a couple backup copies of Gideon and Dromoka's Command. But the Stasis Snare here being a scary thing from Brad's point of view. Of course, Brad doesn't know about it right now. But by continuing to attack Steve's white mana, Brad may be able to keep Steve off of that Stasis Snare. However, with Gideon being so large, Dromoka's Command also represents an effective removal spell against World Breaker here. So we may see a second copy of Dromoka's Command on Steve's following turn, clearing the way for that Gideon for a lethal attack. So Brad does recast that World Breaker, takes out Steve's Plains, leaving him back down to 1 white mana, but I think that's still enough for this second copy of Dromoka's command. And here it is. Adds a counter to the plant, Gideon fights World Breaker, and Brad scoops him up in that our first game of the quarterfinals here for these two players.
Now we will get a chance to see more of effectively second versus same as the first. No sideboarding before this next game in that matchup. But we have got 2 matches in our feature match area. We're going to get a chance for a look in over in our second quarterfinal match. That one being between Seth Manfield and Luis Salvatto right after these messages.
Qualify for the next Pro Tour on Magic Online. Go 5-0 or 4-1 in a preliminary to advance to the finals. You can see the full schedule at mtgo.com. Ultra Pro is the place to go for all your Magic accessories. With card sleeves, deck boxes, playmats, and portfolios showing off the best Magic art, Ultra Pro is the standard and safe storage. Visit ultrapro.com for more information.
Hello and welcome back to this, the second set of quarterfinals here at Pro Tour Shadows over in Innistrad. We've just got Brad Nelson and Steve Rubin doing their shuffling up before their game 2. No sideboarding yet, of course. 2 pre-sideboarded games before any of that. But we're going to get a chance to have a look in on Seth Manfield versus Luis Salvatto. Seth Manfield from the USA, he's playing Esper control, very heavy on the Planeswalkers. We see a number of them already in play here. And on the other side of things, Luis Salvatto from Argentina, he's on red-white Eldrazi and actually has a fair number of Planeswalkers himself, alongside what we see in play there, a Pyromancer's Goggles. Bit of a feature in this top 8, the powerful artifact from Magic Origins.
Yeah, that it is indeed, Tim. And this is a pretty awesome board state that we're tuning into here. Both decks have, kind of their end game plans online here. Seth looking to be in a great spot with the Sphinx of the Final Word, of course, this huge hexproof flyer from Oath of the Gatewatch, next to Sorin Grim Nemesis, a new powerful 6-mana planeswalker from Shadows over Innistrad, as well as Shadows over Innistrad's own Jace. So Luis pondering things on his own turn here, it looks like. He does have access to Pyromancer's Goggles, which means potential for big plays, but we'll take a look what unfolds from here out.
Yeah, Luis Salvatto's deck is an interesting one. When we're dubbing it red-white Eldrazi because most of the creatures that it's running are colorless creatures from the Eldrazi team, but a lot of burn in there as well, which actually squares off fairly nicely against Planeswalkers, especially when you've got the ability to double it up with Pyromancer's Goggles. Unclear how much he's got that can really deal with Sphinx of the Last Word, though. It is going to be able to hit the red zone in a big way each and every turn, and Luis Salvatto, with his targeted removal, may find himself in a spot of trouble here. Seth Manfield, you see the 2 next to his name there, that indicating that he's currently number 2 in our top 25 players, our reigning world champion. Just an absolute force on the Pro Tour, and no big surprises to see him put up another great finish here, though his deck itself is quite surprising. I don't think that within sort of a lot of people's testing, they had seen this sort of Esper heavy Planeswalker control deck as being one of the key players in the format.
Yeah, very true. I had the opportunity to do a deck tech with Seth's teammate Andrew Brown yesterday, and it sounded like part of the way the team came to this deck was realizing that without Dig Through Time as a card advantage engine, that a blue control deck needed to find new ways to sort of lock up the game and generate card advantage over time. And the way that they found to do that was with these powerful Planeswalkers, including Sorin and Jace from Shadows over Innistrad.
So, I mean, as much as we see the life totals hovering a little over 20, I think that Seth Manfield kind of in a fairly safe position here in this game. We're going to jump back to our other match between Brad Nelson and Steve Rubin, see whether or not Brad's able to change his fate a little bit in this second game, in spite of the fact of having started it almost identically to the first with Magmatic Insight to draw a couple of cards, though this time discarding a Drownyard Temple, which is a nice little upgrade. Traverse the old Elven world there, finding him a 3rd land, and soon enough we'll find out whether or not Steve Rubin has a similarly powerful start to what he was able to do in game 1. Westvale Abbey, one of the new additions to this deck, and Sylvan Advocate, we saw it do good work for Andrea Mengucci in his match against John Finkel. Just a very powerful 2-drop that is an option to him. Hangerback Walker the draw here, though, that's another tempting option for Steve Rubin, who from turn 2 can be deploying threats. 2 spells in the graveyard. A Fiery Impulse will be enough to take down this Sylvan Advocate if Brad Nelson wants. It looks like he has other plans here, though. Instead, going on a pilgrimage with Nissa, finding more lands and working towards his end game. We call this a green-red ramp deck. Effectively, it's able to approach the end game around the same time that all of the other decks are heading their mid-game in.
Yeah, and quite a little interesting detail there. At the end of the previous turn, Brad could have fired off Fiery Impulse to take out that Sylvan Advocate. It was upgraded with Spell Mastery to deal 3 damage, but declined to do so. And I think the reason for that is that he does have a copy of Pyromancer's Goggles in his hand, I do believe. So he may just be holding on to those spells to try to get the maximum value out of them, knowing that he has a little bit of time to develop since Steve's deck isn't aggressive in the sense that it's attacking Brad's life total very quickly.
And with a little bit of a surplus of lands in hand at this point, it may be also that he knows that he's not got very many spells to work with in this early game and needs to eke out every little inch of value there. Nissa, Voice of Zendikar coming down, bringing a plant with for Steve Rubin. There we can see on the side of the screen. +1 to put green plant tokens into play. -2 to make your team larger. And, well, we may see it. -7 to draw a lot of cards, gain a lot of life, where a lot is the number of lands you control.
So Brad thinking through his possibilities on his turn here. It does look like he's pretty land flooded at the moment here. Does deploy a 5th land in the Pyromancer's Goggles, and there's that Fiery Impulse that he was saving from earlier in the game. Getting the additional value of taking out a plant, not super great, but it is relevant since Steve's deck does have so many ways to pump up even those 0/1 creatures.
Just a little update for you Team East-West Bowl fans and indeed Seth Manfield fans. He was able to put away that first game against Luis Salvatto, successfully maneuvering his Sphinxes and Planeswalkers in for the win in game 1. They will be on to game 2 soon enough.
And here Steve is just continuing to diversify his threats and get a pretty intimidating board built up here with the Hangerback Walker on 2, Nissa ticking up, making a plant, and I do see a copy of Westvale Abbey, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, in his hand, which means that every additional creature, even a 0/1 plant, is bringing Steve closer and closer to summoning Ormondal, the Profane Prince, which is not something that Brad's going to be able to deal with easily. So looks like Brad just plays his 6th land and passes the turn. Brad really needs to find something like a Magmatic Insight or a Tormenting Voice to copy with that Pyromancer's Goggles. That's the type of card that would get him back into this game right now.
He does have a Fall of the Titans, and that actually kind of a potent board sweeper when you're copying it, because 2 targets naturally, double that up to 4. Even if Steve Rubin does manage to go fairly wide in terms of building a team to sacrifice to Westvale Abbey, it may be that Brad can just make that plan go awry. As things stand, though, Steve Rubin with one of the better creatures to sacrifice to Westvale Abbey in play in that Hangerback Walker, able to attack him with it because he has the option of making it bigger with Nissa later anyway. He doesn't necessarily need to be pumping it with its own ability.
And Steve likely to pass the turn here. Looks like he has done that, leaving up mana for Avacyn, Archangel Avacyn.
Also with mana for a Dromoka's Command, and as we've already mentioned, being able to prevent the damage dealt by spells, pretty important in this matchup.
Now, Brad, as you mentioned earlier, Tim, does have Fall of the Titans in his hand. He's going to hold on to that because often forgotten fact about Fall of the Titans is it an instant. Often these sort of fireball-type variants are sorceries, but Fall of the Titans an instant, so Brad can kind of just leave that up and allow Steve to make the first move, which may be coming soon here.
And he's in the convenient position of, normally with Fall of the Titans, you really do want to enable Surge to be able to play it at a big discount. He's actually got enough lands in play, and the targets that he's looking at are small enough that he may be able to get away with just casting it on its lonesome here, having just as much impact just without having to get the discount.
And really crucial there that Steve did not go for the Archangel Avacyn, tempting as it may have been at the end of Brad's turn, instead opting to leave mana up either for Avacyn herself or Dromoka's Command in response to something that Brad could do. I think Steve is wisely suspicious here of the fact that Brad is passing the turn with 9 mana up, including a Pyromancer's Goggles, and probably thinking about Fall of the Titans specifically, or at least a wealth of options that Brad could have here. So playing more conservatively and leaving himself the option to act second, while he could just continues to pressure with Nissa and Hangerback Walker.
Yeah, for now, Steve simply putting a lot of creatures in play because at some point Brad will have to bite. There are those Westvale Abbeys in play, and once Ormondal's in play, Fall of the Titans not looking as exciting an answer.
Brad draws for the turn. We'll see what he can put together here.
Dragonlord Ataka plays fairly nicely in terms of what he's doing. Not enough mana to leave up to be able to cast too much after it, but he may actually not need all that much mana once you're talking about being able to cast Fall of the Titans with Surge here.
Yeah, Dragonlord Ataka is actually a great draw here. It could allow Brad to clear out some of those tokens. Brad's in a pretty scary position going up against those Westvale Abbeys with tokens continuing to be cranked out by Nissa and the threat of the Hangerback Walker at some point making tokens as well. So other important thing about Dragonlord Ataka is that her enter the battlefield ability distributing damage is not prevented by Dromoka's command like an instant or sorcery would be. So Brad's actually found a really potent way to clear away some of those tokens without leaving Steve the option to use Dromoka's command to prevent it.
So this may be an option where Steve is forced into thinking about Archangel Avacyn. And if Archangel Avacyn comes down, then Brad gets the opportunity to respond with Fall of the Titans before the indestructibility kicks in and potentially get something going here.
Yeah, that is true. Brad has cast a spell this turn, which means Fall of the Titans can be enabled with Surge and could be cast for the with the Pyromancer's Goggles copied with X equals 2. So that would be 2 targets taking 2 damage twice. But we'll see what Steve decides to do. It looks like Dragonlord Ataka distributing some damage among those plant tokens.
So a little test of Steve Rubin's patience here, whether or not he's going to let those tokens go away. There's 2 damage going to Nissa here and 1 to each of the plants that are in play. Hangerback Walker, that one can stay around.
So it's got to be really tempting for Steve here to think about deploying that Archangel Avacyn, giving his creatures indestructible until end of turn.
Yeah, this probably the biggest choice that Steve Rubin has been put to thus far this game. He does bite. He's got Archangel Avacyn coming into play. Let's see how Brad wants to respond. Interestingly, I mean, he could just go for Archangel Avacyn here with the Fall of the Titans. Alternatively, he's going to kill off some creatures, and that will mean that Avacyn is going to flip, killing off the remainder.
So what's happening here is this is a surged Fall of the Titans with X equals 2, which means Brad gets to do 2 damage to each of 2 targets, and then he also gets a copy of that from Pyromancer's Goggles. So a total of 2 damage to 2 different targets doubled. So he could do 4 damage to 1 target like Archangel Avacyn, which I think he probably will do. And then he gets an additional 2 damage twice on 2 different targets. It looks like those are aimed at Nissa.
So a pretty favorable set of exchanges there for Brad Nelson. He's got Dragonlord Ataka in play. He's got rid of one of the potent threats that was in Steve Rubin's hand, and indeed slowed down at least the lurking threat of Westvale Abbey. Steve Rubin has another copy of Nissa Voices Zendikar in hand. That one not too much use right now. Dromoka's command still fairly potent. I suppose that one option that Steve Rubin has, if he decides that he's really worried about those Dragonlord Ataka attacks, at some point he can use his Dromoka's command for an unsuccessful fight with his Hangerback Walker, at least giving him some Thopters to then block with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually just simply having a big creature that Steve can cause his Hangerback Walker to fight at any moment gives him a ton of flexibility with the Westvale Abbey. For example, at the end of Brad's next turn, Steve could cause a fight with the Hangerback Walker, cause it to intentionally die with 4 +1/+1 counters on it. That makes 4 Thopters, and then he could untap and have option to use Westvale Abbey to create Ormondal.
Yeah, sometimes you lose the battle to win the war. course, Westvale Abbey itself able to pump out black-white cleric tokens, but I think that Steve probably quite likely to want to be able to keep his mana up, keep his options a little bit more open.
So it looks like Steve cranks up the Hangerback Walker with its own ability, uses Nissa's -2 to put a +1/+1 counter on Plant and Hangerback Walker, and thinks through what to do with the rest of his turn. Looks like he'll probably pass, leaving option for Dromoka's Command, and then also option to use the other Westvale Abbey at the end of Brad's turn. Brad untaps and draws. Looks like he's picked up a nice one. That is a Magmatic Insight to go with his Drownyard Temple in hand.
Drownyard Temple, basically the perfect land to discard to Magmatic Insight. You can still pay 3 mana to put it into play from your graveyard.
And this one of the really powerful interactions with Pyromancer's Goggles, because cards like Magmatic Insight and Tormenting Voice ask you to discard an additional card to cast the first copy, but if you're copying it for free, you don't need to discard an additional card. So you're actually getting it sort of better than a second copy. You're drawing, in this case, 4 cards while only discarding 1. And that really serves to be the sort of mid to late game engine for Brad's deck. Often these ramp decks sort of run out of gas. They expend a lot of resources getting lands onto the battlefield, and then they're at the mercy of the top of their deck to see if they can draw into big threats. But with the Pyromancer's Goggles in play, Brad can sort of just churn through his library at a pretty rapid rate. So huge, huge draw step there for Brad, and that really helps him get back into this game a little bit.
Stevie Rubin there, not too worried about losing this to that big Dragon Lord Otaka attack. He does have an extra copy of the Planeswalker in his hand. And a follow-up play from Brad here, kind of the one action card that he drew that he doesn't already have a legendary copy of in play, that being a Hedron Archive. In principle, it's something he can sacrifice any time for drawing cards, but equally he may just simply say, I want to have even more mana available so that when I do cast a big burn spell, it can be lethal.
Yeah, with this many mana sources in play, Brad is like one draw step away from ending the game at any time with a Fall of the Titans. Of course, we do know Steve Rubin has Dromoka's Command in his hand to prevent that damage, but it's something that both players need to be thinking about.
Yeah, we've reached the point in the game now where Steve Rubin needs to think very carefully about when to deploy any Dromoka's commands he has, and equally when even just to tap out of green and white, because with Fall of the Titans being an instant, all it takes is one other instant for Surge, and any moment in the game could be lethal.
That's right, and you could see that Steve was really thinking carefully about that, opted not to activate Westvale Abbey. That would have left his shields down for an instant speed burn spell, and he does not want to do that here. So on his own turn here, looks like Dromoka's Command causing a fight between Hangerback Walker and Dragon Lord Atarka.
It's enough to prompt a response from Brad Nelson.
And it looks to me like this is leading into wanting to create a bunch of Thopter tokens and then activating Westvale Abbey to turn into Ormondal.
So Brad's cashing in his Hedron Archive, just desperately digging for a useful response here. Does not find one, so the Dromoka's Command resolves. 5 Thopter tokens coming into play, and 5 kind of the magic number right here. First Westvale Abbey transformation taking place.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, Steve's deck does not deal very well with Dragon Lord Atarka. One of its only ways to interact with flyers is to create Thopter tokens, but as we do see, Dragon Lord Atarka does have Flample, Tim, which is the combination of flying and trample. So very difficult to deal with by blocking, and Steve may figure that his better option is to get some lifelink out of Ormondal and pressure Brad's life total as well. So Brad getting knocked down to 4 life and under a ton of pressure from this Ormondal.
Yeah, Steve Rubin gaining some life there, not irrelevant at all. I mean, at some point it becomes tricky for Brad to burn people out. It's worth noting, and it's something I saw him do earlier on in the tournament, tapping a Pyromancer's Goggles, casting a second Pyromancer's Goggles, getting rid of the first one to Legendary, but leaving that red mana floating, tapping a second Pyromancer's Goggles in order to mean that all of a sudden you're getting multiple copies of a big Fall of the Titans.
And here we come on to Steve's turn here. It does look like he has a Stasis Snare for Dragon Lord Atarka. That will clear the way for Ormondal, and Brad packs him in.
So 2-0 before sideboarding for Steve Rubin. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that matchup changes any once players have access to the 15 cards in their sideboard. We potentially have as many as 3 games here. It's the first of 3 wins, so Steve may be able to lock it up in 1, but I'm sure that Brad's looking to fight back and make it a full 5-game set. We're going to get a chance to jump back across to our other match, though, and see how things are going between Team East West Bowl's Seth Manfield and Luis Salvatto from Argentina of Team Dex Protection. And it looks like kind of second verse, same as the first here. We've got Planeswalkers in play for Seth Manfield and Luis Salvatto trying to find a way of angling around both Narset Transcendent and that there Jace Unraveler of Secrets.
Yeah, yet again we tune into Seth with a pretty commanding board presence here with 2 Planeswalkers on the battlefield. Looks like he's in the middle of his own turn with plenty of cards in hand and all his mana untapped. So Jace does use its -2 to bounce Matter Reshaper back to Luis's hand, and things are looking great here for Seth Manfield. Now, I said it earlier, I had the chance to talk to Andrew Brown a little bit, who is Seth's teammate and also played this same deck, and they actually talked about this matchup a little bit. One of them, I'm not sure if it was Seth or one of their other teammates, did play against Luis Salvatto in the Swiss, and they said one of the key ways that these decks matched up is that Luis has chosen not to play any copies of Reality Smasher in his deck, despite having access to colorless Eldrazi, and their team was very, very happy about that because Reality Smasher is a card that Seth's deck does not deal well with at all.
So an interesting play there. We see Luis Salvatto choosing to use Lightning Axe on his own Matter Reshaper simply because it's more useful to him to get an extra card off the top of his deck than to have that back in his hand. Finds a Magmatic Insight, so that potentially quite a nice pickup there. And we see the reason that Jace was perfectly happy to go down to 0 loyalty. There was another copy of Jace, the second copy of Jace.
There's always more Jaces, right, Tim?
Well, I mean, in this deck, there's more Jaces than most, because in addition to having Jace Unraveler of Secrets, there are, at least in the sideboard, copies of Jace Vryn's Prodigy, where many decks are having to settle for just 4 Jace. This one's got 5. There we see the Magmatic Insight play, discarding Drownyard Temple. That was a nice little move for Brad Nelson. It's great here too, but in each case, it may be on the wrong side of things. Chandra Flamecaller in hand for Luis Salvatto, but not the mana to cast her just yet. Instead, leading things off with a Thought-Knot Seer to take a look at Seth Manfield's hand, assuming it resolves.
So what least needs to happen here is hopefully to get a peek at Seth's hand with this Thought-Knot Seer and strip away a counterspell, if there is one, and then hopefully next turn get down that Chandra Flamecaller and start pressuring those Planeswalkers. Now, Chandra is excellent at pressuring opposing Planeswalkers, so if he can strip Seth of defenses in the form of counterspells, he might be able to get back into this game here.
Of course, the challenge of stripping your opponent of counterspells when they have counterspells is that if they have more than one, they might just use the first one on your threat. Thought-Knot Seer not making it to the battlefield. That meaning that those Planeswalkers remain safe for another turn. They get to tick up, tick down, do pretty much whatever they want. And the longer the game goes on, the better things look for Seth here. Effectively, we have a 3-on-1 match. I think I spotted a copy of Sorin Grim Nemesis in Seth Manfield's hand. It'll be interesting to see whether or not he thinks he's got enough mana that he can afford to cast yet a third Planeswalker, leaving some mana up for answers. And once you have 3, even Chandra is going to struggle to win that fight. Worth noting that Seth Manfield is on 8 life and Luis Salvatto is playing a deck with a fair amount of burn in it. It's not as if he's completely out of this game. We saw him against John Finkel, able to string together burn spells and Chandra attacks with elementals such that even when nominal control had been established, there was a fiery conclusion to assorted games. But right now, it does appear that Seth Manfield very much in control. There's the third Planeswalker, and that has to be a bit of a problem here for Luis Salvatto. We'll see whether or not he can put something together in the next turn or two, but the other players are ready on the other match, so we're not going to hold them for too long, I don't think, here, Ian. And Sorin ticking up there, finding a land for Seth Manfield. at some point we may see a turn with multiple ultimates. Not something to try and say too quickly, but when you succeed, it's very powerful indeed. But here is Chandra from Luis Salvatto.
And this is sort of Luis's last chance here. Thankfully for him, looks like no counterspell from Seth Manfield. That Thought Not Seer did its job last turn by baiting out a counterspell and getting countered. Those 2/3/1 elementals do enter the battlefield and start to attack, but Seth takes one out with a removal spell. And yeah, the trouble for Luis is that these planeswalkers on Seth's side of the battlefield just have so much loyalty. I mean, Narset and ticking up for 2 per turn, and all of them starting with high loyalty totals to begin with, means that Chandra has a ton of work to do over multiple turns to catch up, and it just may not be enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that this is not necessarily a matchup where Seth Manfield's creature removal has a huge amount of targets in game 1, but he is able to use it to help against Chandra. And here we see Sorin just directly going for Chandra, dealing with the one planeswalker Luis Salvatto has in play. And basically, at this point, Seth Manfield has Salvatto in kind of the death grip. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take for Salvatto to tap out, I think.
Yeah, so why don't we jump back over to our other feature match table, Tim, and take a look at Brad Nelson versus Steve Rubin here.
We will, of course, get updates for you from that other match. If we find that there's something crazy going on in terms of the Argentinian finding a way back in that, we will make sure that we bring you all the action. But in the meantime, let's see what, after sideboarding, Brad Nelson can do about this green-white token threat from Steve Rubin.
So here we are in game 3. Steve Rubin is up 2 games, and this being the 3rd game of the match is the first game where players are allowed to sideboard. So we'll see if that can change things a little bit here. I think the outcome so far is maybe a little bit surprising to those of us at home who are maybe predicting how the matchup would go. It looks like pre-sideboard, at least, that Brad Nelson's deck was in pretty good shape with all those red removal spells and sweepers and so on, but things just did not play out that way for him in the first 2 games. We'll see if sideboarding can make any difference.
Yeah, Steve Rubin here with a nice clean curve. I mean, his deck does go low to the ground, so not necessarily surprising that he was able to get out a 1-drop in Thraben Inspector on turn 1, then a Hangerback Walker on 2 immediately the turn after. Brad Nelson drawing extra cards with that Tormenting Voice, but he's going to need to sometime fairly soon deal with what's going on the board. He says, well, you know what, that's what this Kozilek's Return's all about. Deals with both creatures, though there is a Thopter token coming off that Hangerback Walker. At least it's only 1 token, I suppose.
Yeah, and Kozilek's Return is a great thing for Brad to have drawn this early in the game. It's one of the key cards in the matchup for sure. It represents, 2 board sweeps just from a single card if he can get up to a World Breaker. And we do see that Brad has a World Breaker in his hand. So his game plan is just going to be to kind of buy time, continue developing his mana, and hopefully get up to that World Breaker for a second sweep from Kozilek's Return.
This is the Voice of Zendikar coming down there, and as I think is likely to be customary in this matchup, making plant tokens initially. I mean, basically what Steve Rubin's looking to do is go wide, have a good number of creatures such that all of his pump spells, which are mass pump spells, it must be said, are at maximum effectiveness.
So let's take a little peek there at Brad's hand. Looks like he has a couple copies of Worldbreaker, Fall of the Titans, Draconic Roar, and Pyromancer's Goggles. No 5th land yet, but if he can hit his 5th land, that means he gets to play Pyromancer's Goggles, which is a 6th mana source, and then he's well on his way to Worldbreaker. So a lot of this game is going to hinge on whether Brad can hit another untapped land on his turn, or at least, something like Anissa's Pilgrimage to keep accelerating his mana. Meanwhile, on the other side, we'll take a peek at Steve's hand. Looks like he's sitting on just lands here. So he has cast a Hangerback Walker for 2, but that's his last relevant threat right now. And that's really, really good news for Brad. If he can get through this board state that Steve has right now, he might be able to turn the corner and get into the clear. So it looks like this is on Steve's turn, a Draconic Roar into Fall of the Titans, just clearing out some of those small creatures.
All of that was in response to an activation of Nissa in order to give Steve's team extra +1/+1 counters. So a timely use of those spells to minimize the effectiveness of the Planeswalker.
And there is that 5th untapped land in the form of a Drownyard Temple for Brad. That's huge. It allows him to play Pyromancer's Goggles there, getting up to a 6th mana source. And if he can find a 7th, then the World Breakers are going to start hitting. And that's going to be bad news for Steve Rubin. So things looking a lot more positive for Brad than those previous 2 games were.
Yeah, we see Steve, he has managed to pick up a copy of Gideon Ally of Zendikar, but suddenly not quite got the same kind of an offensive force that he had mid-turns ago. Not able to cast the Gideon with the amount of lands he has in play. Simply makes a plant, attacks for 3 with the creatures he has, the 0/1 plant becoming a 1/2, and they're 2 points in the air from that Thopter. And we get a chance to see whether or not Brad has found his 7th land. It looks like he has not, instead having to go for a Nissa's Pilgrimage, with spell mastery, meaning that he can be confident of being able to cast, well, either of those World Breakers next turn. Though crucially for Steve, not both.
Yeah, not the ideal draw for Brad, but you know, a pretty reasonable second best or third best card that he could draw there. Does allow him to continue developing his mana, and actually having that extra forest there means he has a little bit of wiggle room to maybe buy back a World Breaker should something happen to it. Although we do know from Steve's hand that his way of dealing with World Breaker right now is a Declaration of Stone, a Declaration in Stone rather, in his hand.
I mean, the extra lands in hand from Nissa's Pilgrimage also kind of useful for Brad with all of those card drawing spells in his deck. They all force you to discard a card as part of their cost, and when you're kind of getting free lands from your deck from various other spells, it means that those card drawing spells just super duper efficient for him.
So Steve has had a nice few last draw steps. A couple turns ago we peeked in and he was sitting on just lands, but now he's picked up Gideon, Archangel Avacyn, and a Declaration in Stone, maybe to take out a pesky World Breaker. So yeah, this game has evened up quite well here as we head into the mid game here, and I'm excited to see how things turn out.
And the tough thing for Brad here is that, yes, things are kind of even in terms of the quality of cards in hand and what people are able to do in subsequent turns. In the meantime, Steve is rumbling in for a few damage each turn. Those tokens, they aren't as large as many of the creatures that you'll see in Standard, but if they keep attacking, sooner or later, it's going to cause a problem for Brad Nelson that he's going to absolutely have to deal with.
And Brad picks up a Cinderglade for the turn. He would have much rather seen something like a Tormenting Voice or a Magmatic Insight. So not perfect for him, but he does at least get to play his first World Breaker this turn and have option to flashback Kozilek's Return for 5 damage from the graveyard.
Given that there's a second copy of World Breaker in Brad Nelson's hand, is there a temptation here, Ian, to maybe hold off for just 1 turn on using that Kozilek's Return and maybe net a little bit of extra value?
Yeah, there definitely is a temptation. There's also a very interesting thing. The way Kozilek's Return works is when you play your big creature, like a World Breaker, you got a trigger that goes on the stack, and when the trigger resolves, you get to decide whether or not to take that action of exiling Kozilek's Return and dealing 5 damage. So Brad will actually have full information about whether Steve has decided to respond in some way before he chooses whether or not to pull the trigger on the Kozilek's Return. So that's particularly important in this case because Steve does have an Archangel Avacyn. So I believe what can happen here is Steve plays the Avacyn response, says my team gets indestructible, and then Brad can simply say, okay, I'll choose not to use my Kozilek's Return here.
So that Archangel Avacyn was played in response to the trigger, which when the trigger resolves says you may exile Kozilek's Return in order to deal 5 damage to all creatures. Given that they all had indestructible by the time that trigger resolved, he got given the option. He said, you know what, let's just leave that one in the graveyard.
And that's going to be huge for Brad because, as we know, he does have a second copy of World Breaker for another option at using the Kozilek's Return next turn. Other relevant thing about World Breaker is it does have reach, Tim, so it can hold off this Archangel Avacyn as well as the rest of the smaller creatures that Steve has on his side. However, Brad's life total getting down to 11, that's pretty low. And we do see a Declaration in Stone taking out World Breaker and actually exiling it, which is very important since it can come back from the graveyard. Nissa pumps up the team here. And there's a Gideon, which can also make an emblem for another +1/+1 to the team. So each of those plants is 2 damage, plus Avacyn there coming in for 6. And that will be game for Steve Rubin, sweeping that match in 3 games to 0.
A clean 3-0 victory there for Steve Rubin. That meaning that we have our 3rd semi-finalist already established. 1 match left in these are quarterfinals here at Pro Tour Shadows over in Innistrad. Let's jump across and find out what's going on with Seth Manfield versus Luis Salvatto. I see them shuffling up. I presume that means that we have got a little bit more of a result here than we had previously. It looked like Seth Manfield was in commanding position for that second game, and we're just hearing that, yes, he did take that one. So Seth Manfield currently 2-0 in the lead here. He made it into the top 8 as a higher seed. He was able to play first, but for each of these subsequent games, it has been Luis Salvatto's privilege, and that hasn't appeared to change the way that these games are going. This is the first game where there's sideboards involved for Seth Manfield against Luis Salvatto. Let's have a little look at those sideboards and see whether or not, as these players are shuffling up for their third game, there's something that really might sway things. Looks like the player's just presenting here. Each of these players, of course, very keen to start off on a solid 7. We can see a couple of Drownyard Temples, a Westvale Abbey, normally only having colorless sources, kind of potentially a problem for many decks. As it happens with a Thought-Knot Seer in hand for Luis Salvatto, colorless sources not quite so much of a concern, though 4 lands in total might be a little high. On the other side of things, an island and a Shambling Vent, that's all of the colors. Is it enough lands for Seth Manfield? We'll find out soon enough.
Yeah, and a tricky thing for Luis, although he does have plenty of lands there, he does not have access to any red mana, and his deck is far more red than it is white. So that's definitely something that he has to think twice about. But looks like both players have kept their hands, both with possibilities for things to go a little bit wrong in terms of the lands that they have access to right now. Seth being a little bit short on lands, and Luis having plenty of lands but not the right colors just yet.
It may well be that just this very next turn, Luis Salvatto finds out exactly what is up. Evolving Wild's a key draw there for Seth Manfield in terms of just keeping things flowing. But we're going to get a chance to get a proper look at Seth Manfield's hand, not just on the side of our screen, but right there on the center. Look at all of those Planeswalkers in his hand. 2 copies of Narset Transcendent, 1 copy of Sorin Grim Nemesis alongside it, a suite of removal in Anguished Unmaking, Ruinous Path, and Languish. And finally, just the one creature there in Kalitas, Traitor of Get.
So as Luis is deciding what to take from Manfield's hand, let's take a look at Luis's hand and how that influences what he might choose here. So again, we see 4 red spells, no red producing lands, though he does have a Pyromancer's Goggles. So if he can get a 5th land, he'll have access to unlocking the rest of his hand there.
Yeah, and those Pyromancer's Goggles plus Tormenting Voice means that any concerns he's got about the nature of his draws potentially all cleaned up in just the 1 spell. I guess that he's got to consider both the potential power of each of these cards against him, in addition to just the fact that right now Seth Manfield can only cast the Anguished Unmaking as in terms of the cards in his hand. Sorry, he's taking Ruinous Path there. Seth presumably not too worried. He's got lots of powerful cards in his hand. It's just a matter of if he can find the time to deploy them. I mean, a 4/4 Thought-Knot Seer will close out a game comparatively fast without a removal spell, and even the Anguished Unmaking is going to cost Seth Manfield 3 life.
Yeah, Thought-Knot Seer, a card that was designed to put pressure on these controlling Esper controller or blue control decks, or also on red-green ramp decks as well. And here we see coming out on turn 4, as was intended, the Thought-Knot Seer still being a powerful threat against Seth Manfield.
Seth Manfield, though, I mean, he's both drawn a Plains, a key draw for the turn. He did have another sort of shot in the gun, though. If he did use Anguished Unmaking on the 4/4, then he would be able to draw a card as it left the battlefield. As it stands, though, with a 4th land, going for Narset Transcendent, starts at 6 loyalty, ticks up 1, and not a spell on top, so effectively just a little sneaky peek at what is to come for Seth Manfield there.
And again, Tim, the high loyalty on those Planeswalkers like Narset is the reason why Seth can just play this Narset into a hostile board of a Thought-Knot Seer, rather than having to take a step back and cast a removal spell like Anguished Unmaking on the Thought-Knot Seer. So this just, in a strange way, it allows Seth to get ahead on tempo, where he can play his Planeswalker, boost it up to enough loyalty to survive, and then be able to untap freely, and now he can spend his mana in a reactive way while having that Planeswalker on the board, giving him the value every turn. So really nice by Seth there. And unfortunately for Luis, he did not hit his 5th land. He did not hit his red mana source. So still just sitting on a clunky hand there, full of tons of cards, but being unable to cast them.
This the gamble that he signed up for when he drew his opening hand and elected to keep. It seems like Seth Manfield, the one who's really been able to draw through, and -2 in order to give a spell rebound. That Languish there will be coming back.
Yeah, really interesting play there, really highlighting some of the flexibility of Narset there. Seth used the -2, so that Languish will be coming back again next turn. And even though the Languish took care of all of Luis's creatures, what that does is it challenges Luis, are you going to play another creature next turn, says Seth? And if so, I have this Languish coming back. Again, it's just sort of giving Seth that tempo advantage and breathing room that his deck desperately wants to keep getting those Planeswalkers online and getting value out of them. So meanwhile, Luis does hit his 5th land. It is a mountain, which means he has option to either cast the Pyromancer's Goggles or start deploying some of his red cards here. It looks to me, based on his hand, that getting out the Goggles would be the ideal thing, just to do so while Seth is tapped out, doesn't have access to, like a Spell Shrivel or some other counter spell. And the rest of his hand just becomes a lot more powerful when he has access to Pyromancer's Goggles. So I'd love to see him play the Goggles here. Other option, of course, being that he could just play out that Eldrazi Obligator as a 3-power hasted creature and try to take out Narset. But then again, as we said, that Languish is waiting there to rebound and will take out the Eldrazi Obligator on the following turn.
We can see there that Manfield's hand, it's changed a little since last we saw it. Grasp of Darkness, the newest edition there. All the other cards, I believe, are ones that Luis Salvatto knows about just as well as we do. It looks like Fall of the Titans was the choice there for Luis Salvatto in order to kill off Narset. Leaves him with creatures in hand, but means that if he wants to resolve that Pyromancer's Goggles, he's going to have to find another window to do it. I suppose, given that he knows that Anguished Unmaking is in Seth Manfield's hand, there is
a great point, Tim. Yeah,
a good reason for him to hold back on that one. At least get some value out of it. Seth Manfield on the aggro plan here, getting creatures in play. Not many creatures anywhere in Seth Manfield's list, but Kalitas, Traitor of Get, is one that has come in from the sideboard in order to make life a little tricky for Luis Salvatto here. And here comes the Pyromancer's Goggles, along with a land that means that he's going to be able to immediately cast Tormenting Voice. Discards 1 card, draws 4. I think he can probably live with that rate. Eldrazi Obligator with a rare target in play, but actually, he says, I think that I'd rather have 4 cards than that one.
Yeah, really nice Luis taking advantage of that window, getting value out of the Goggles right away, as you said, Tim, and doing so on a turn where Seth was tapped out, at least tapped low enough that he couldn't react. We do see a negate in Seth's hand, but he was not able to cast that turn, having only 1 mana untapped. So now he'll have to play the reactive role here with an Anguished Unmaking at some point in order to get rid of those Goggles, and he may just go ahead and do that on his main phase. Yep, and Luis anticipates it, having seen that earlier with the Thought-Knot Seer.
First blood in this game took a little bit of a while to achieve, but the life totals have changed a little bit here. Seth gained 3 from his attack with Kalitas, immediately lost it again as he cast Anguished Unmaking, and Luis Salvatto just sort of trying to put things back together after a kind of clunky start, but Chandra Flamecaller in his hand as one of his more recent draws is certainly going to help with that. There we see Chandra, the big Oath of the Gatewatch Planeswalker, coming into play, and plenty of options here. I mean, he could fully cash in Chandra's ability in order to kill off Kalitas, or just simply get some hits in here. With 4 loyalty, it's not as if Kalitas on his own is going to be able to kill off the Planeswalker.
But unfortunately for Luis, Seth does have that copy of Negate and does have the mana available to cast it now. So I imagine we'll see him fire that off, and we do. What better card to negate than Chandra Flamecaller? That's what it's brought in for. Either that or the Goggles are the 2 main things to stop. But Luis takes advantage of, again, Seth being tapped low and uses a Lightning Axe to take out Kalitas. So yeah, the board back to square one here. Empty boards for both players and sort of transitioning into the next phase of the game. Although I will say Seth looking to be in pretty good shape here. I think that the longer the games go on for him, as long as he can keep Pyromancer's Goggles off the table, he's going to be in pretty good shape. And we do see 2 powerful Planeswalkers in his hand in the form of Narset Transcendent, a 2nd copy, as well as Sorin Grim Nemesis. And I have to imagine that Sorin's going to come down this turn, Tim.
Yeah, every time I see Sorin come down on a completely empty board, I mean, what do you do from there? You need to deploy multiple threats before you can even realistically start doing anything to deal with Sorin's already high loyalty total. And it does not take very long whatsoever for Sorin to just close out any kind of game.
So let's take a look at Sorin Grim Nemesis, a new powerful Planeswalker from Shadows over Innistrad. Enters the battlefield with 6 loyalty, takes up to 7 right away. It has this sort of, I like to think of it like a Dark Confidant ability, Tim, where you're revealing your top card, except it's your opponent that loses life equal to its converted mana cost. 2nd ability can pay X loyalty to deal X damage to a creature or Planeswalker of your opponent's. and you gain X life, and then, of course, a powerful ultimate, making a number of 1/1 Black Vampire Knights equal to the highest life total among players. So really, really powerful card when it does resolve, though it does cost 6 mana.
Luis Salvatto going with the Goblin Dark Dwellers to cast Tormenting Voice once more from his graveyard. Gets rid of a land and finds a Planeswalker of his own in Nahiri alongside a Thought-Knot Seer, but not the mana to cast either of them. Has to pass things back with just the one threat on the board. And in a one-on-one fight, Sorin does pretty well against most things, but as it stands, there is a Grasp of Darkness in hand for Seth Manfield if he wants to be able to deal with this Goblin Dark Dwellers, and indeed a Duress to make sure that he knows what's coming and can get rid of the worst threats. An interesting choice actually here for Seth Manfield. Quite a powerful hand here for Luis Salvatto. Matter Reshaper, Nahiri the Harbinger, Thought-Knot Seer, and Fall of the Titans. Attacking on a few different axes here. Any preferences for you, Ian, as to what he should take?
Yeah, it's tough. Actually, neither card is particularly threatening right now. We can see if Seth leaves Salvatto with Nahiri, then he can simply use Sorin to deal X damage to it on a following turn and take care of her relatively easily. On the other hand, if he leaves Salvatto with Fall of the Titans, I mean, the Surge Fall of the Titans can ping away at his Planeswalkers a little bit and do some work there, but I don't think either card is particularly scary. And yeah, it looks like Seth agrees that he is not afraid of Nahiri at the moment, given the Sorin that he has on the battlefield, and just takes out that Fall of the Titans. I guess it has the most potential later on in the game to come back and bite him.
Still more action, though, for Seth Manfield on this his turn before he needs to worry about passing things back. Ticks up Sorin. And Grasp of Darkness, well, at this point, the one that he had in hand, when he casts, I mean, he's kind of not had to reveal a card from hand. He just gets to play the one that he's drawn, should he so choose.
So here is the second copy of Narset Transcendent so far this game.
And there the Grasp of Darkness. And notably, Narset on 4 loyalty, not 6. That because the -2 getting applied very quickly. Grasp of Darkness will be coming back and getting cast again. Kind of that same thing that we saw with Languish earlier on. Cast a removal spell to clear the board and creates a situation where there's a strong incentive for Luis Salvatto not to play more threats onto the board. Looks like Salvatto has decided that he can't afford to literally do nothing. He's going to get that Nahiri the Harbinger down, even though there is Nahiri's arch nemesis on the other side of the battlefield.
Yeah, this is a pretty thematic confrontation here.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of thematic things actually in this second set of quarterfinals. Brad Nelson's Eldrazi versus the combined might of some Zendikar Planeswalkers. And here on Shadows over Innistrad, we get back to Innistrad and the fight between Nahiri and Sorin very much real.
So interesting, Luis did play that Matter Reshaper into the rebounded Grasp of Darkness, so perhaps just wanting to cash in the Matter Reshaper for any other card. I guess he values more than the slow and small creature on this board state. And Seth feeling like he must be feeling like he's in pretty good shape. There is what I mean. He has the option to have Sorin deal 6 damage to Nahiri and have Seth gain 6 life. That second ability can hit Planeswalkers.
All of these Planeswalkers have got the sort of secret special ability of having lots of loyalty to begin with, but having Seth Manfield effectively having the jump on gaining loyalty means that even removing quite a lot of loyalty from Sorin in order to deal with Nahiri does not cost him either of his Planeswalkers in play.
Yeah, it looks like Seth went for sort of the half and half route to deal 2 damage to it with a Shambling Vent and the remaining 4 damage with Sorin, Grim Nemesis.
The 2 life, obviously pleasant, but the main thing there, keeping extra loyalty on Sorin, because there are some ways that Luis Salvatto can deal with Planeswalkers, one notable one, of course, being Fiery Temper. 3 damage on a 2 loyalty Planeswalker, kind of a big deal. On a 4 loyalty one, not so much.
And really interesting here, in comes Needle Spires, activating and threatening to attack for 4 damage, aimed at Sorin. And looks like Seth just decides to block and trade off with his own Shambling Vent. Seth also had the option to use a second copy of Grasp of Darkness that we know Seth has had in his hand for a while, but Luis does not know about. Remember that the Grasp of Darkness revealed previously off of Sorin was used on a prior turn, so Luis is unaware of that copy of Grasp of Darkness in Seth's hand.
So on turns when there's not too much going on, each of these Planeswalkers has ways of generating card advantage for Seth Manfield in a more straightforward card drawing kind of way. And then as and when threats come from Luis Salvatto, there are ways for Seth to neutralize them with his Planeswalkers too. On 30 life here, with 2 Planeswalkers in play ticking up, he's got to be feeling great.
And Luis, it looks like, has no cards left in hand, so being at the mercy of the top of his library here. He does have a Pyromancer's Goggles on the battlefield, which, you know, can allow some explosive things to happen with Tormenting Voice or Magmatic Insight, but that's going to take at least 2 turns from the top of Luis's deck in order to arrange that.
And I can't help but think that after sideboarding, Seth Manfield unlikely to have fewer counter spells in his deck.
Yeah, that is true. We did see that negate earlier, which I believe is out of the sideboard. And Seth just starting to pull ahead as these Planeswalker control decks do. We know leaving these Planeswalkers on the battlefield turn after turn is just incremental advantage ticking away in the favor of Seth Manfield here as we see him drawing more cards with Sorin, peeking at his top card with Narset. Missed this turn, but yeah, those Planeswalkers still increasing in loyalty, eventually going to be threatening their ultimates, and Luis just has so much work to do to pull his way out of this game as Seth deploys a Sphinx of the Final Word, another card that Luis is going to be hard-pressed to answer here. 5/5 flying with hexproof.
And the best that Luis can do here, deploying a few tiny creature tokens to the board as he sees Sphinx of the Final Word coming down. It's not going to take too many swings here for him to go from 11 to 0. But, you know, there's still fighting him yet. He's trying to find every way he can in order to stay in this. And yeah, the black-white token from Westphal Abbey alongside a Goblin Dark Dwellers. Now, his graveyard's relatively stocked here. I'm sure he can find something to at least help him in the position that he's in. However, he's got an awful lot of different things to deal with here.
Yeah, that's true. I imagine the best thing for Luis here would be something like a Tormenting Voice or a Magmatic Insight. I don't remember, I can't see from here if he does have another copy of such a card in his graveyard.
He had used one earlier on. I think that he may be stuck with just copies of Lightning Axe in his graveyard, which, if Sphinx of the Final Word were a different 5/5 flyer, would look excellent.
That's
Unfortunately, right. Hexproof says no thank you for that plan. Grasp of Darkness #2, dealing with Goblin Dark Dwellers #2, and Seth Manfield here just, well, probably about a turn away, depending on exactly how Sorin's uptick goes for him from closing this game out.
And this has got to be a frustrating position for Salvatto, just seeing himself being squeezed out of this game. He does have those Pyromancer's Goggles, one of the key pieces to his deck, but unfortunately, the Goggles doing nothing to help him in this situation with no spells to pair up with it.
And there's the handshake. This is our final semi-finalist, Seth Manfield. He will be facing off against the winner of our first quarterfinal, sorry, Steve Rubin. We have all of our quarterfinals locked in at this point, and we've seen some fantastic magic here in Duke.
Yeah, absolutely. These, again, top 8 full of 8 different decks. These are unique things we haven't seen much of before in Standard, and it's awesome to see these games play out among, you know, 8 of the top players in Magic right now. Just a fantastic top 8 on multiple fronts here. So can't wait to see more Magic.
And I mean, worth noting, all 3 of those, both of those matches went 3 straight games. Do we think that there was a certain amount of matchup advantage going on there?
I definitely think so, at least in the matchup that we just watched there between Seth and Luis. I think Seth pretty squarely favored the way those games played out.
But it'll be interesting to see whether or not those matchup advantages persist as we head into our semi-finals. We're all done here from the quarterfinals. I'm going to head things over back to Rich on the news desk.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Ian, with the call there on quarterfinals 3 and 4. I've been joined by Brian David Marshall, the Pro Tour historian and Hall of Famer, and unfortunately vanquished quarterfinalist Luis Scott Vargas. Never easy, but we thank you for being with us, of course, as we head down the stretch here. Now there are just 3 matches remaining. We're on lunch, which means we've got about half an hour with you with a ton of stuff. And I must say, first up, around about 10-15 minutes from now, the director of global organized play, Ellen Bergeau, will magically have transformed into that seat right there beside me. She has a ton of very important and very interesting stuff to share with us all. So do not miss that during the lunch break. Ellen Bergeau, Director of Global Organised Play, right here live at the news desk with all the latest news in the world of organised play. All right, so why don't we kick off by reminding you what happened here this morning. Let's take a look at the bracket. And we began with our colleague here, Luis Scott Vargas. He was up against Shota Yasuoka. Luis, a tough matchup, and unfortunately, sometimes that's how it plays out as well.
Yeah, I got swept pretty hard by Shota. My draws were great. I can't really complain about them, and his deck was just a very good matchup for him, and he ended up defeating me.
Yep, so Shota advances by 3 games to 1. And in our other quarterfinal that played simultaneously, one of the great players of all time, John Finkel, with his fantastically fun Seasons Past control deck, was up against Andrea Mengucci with Bank Company. BDM, what happened in that one?
Well, this may be the worst matchup for the Seasons Past control deck. And Andrea Mengucci just Sylvan advocated and just kind of ran over John Finkel here.
Yep, so Andrea Mengucci, the young Italian winner of the World Magic Cup in 2015, advances to the semi-finals. Bottom half of the bracket then, and that saw Brad Nelson up against Steve Rubin. Now, Nelson was playing red-green goggles ramp, Rubin on green-white tokens. This was a 3-0 sweep, but if you hear that, most people would have said, so we're going to see Brad Nelson advance. We did not. We saw Steve Rubin make it in. Luis, what happened there?
Mostly Westvale Abbey is just really difficult for Brad's deck to beat. I flipped Westvale Abbey once you get Ormondal into play. Brad doesn't really have a great answer to that, and with cards like Declaration of Stone taking out Worldbreaker, it's hard for Brad to mount an offense.
Yeah, and when we were talking to Brad earlier in the weekend, he said the one deck I don't really want to, the one deck we're really soft against is a Gideon deck. He wasn't expecting to see a lot of them, and he was really rooting against team face-to-face games down the stretch Saturday for putting one of their green-white tokens, decks here into the top 8.
Right, so in fact, perhaps certainly not a shock, but a mild surprise. Steve Rubin, Platinum Pro, is through to the semi-finals.
Worth noting, of all the top 8 competitors, Steve Rubin is the only player without a title. Even Luis Salvatto, who may be the least known player in the top 8, is a Sunday Super Series champion.
That's right, from 2015. So
everyone else, Steve Rubin, 2 matches away from maybe remedying that.
All right, so Rubin advances to the semi-final. That left 1 quarterfinal going. That was Seth Manfield with Esper Control against the red-white Eldrazi goggles list of Luis Salvatto of Argentina. Phenomenal performance by him getting into his first top 8. But this was another 3-0 sweep, and as we've just seen, it was Seth Manfield who advanced. BDM, a pretty heavy favorite for Seth there?
Pretty heavy favorite. I'm reminded of the line from the Vice documentary about Magic where one of the Stax players was describing how his deck worked, and it was kind of like a boa constrictor, as they said there. He just kept squeezing until eventually his planeswalkers, his creature lands, just his card advantage just pushed Luis Salvatto out of the matchup.
The other thing you have to remember is Luis S's are just known for their bad luck, so it's just no surprise that he got crushed.
I mean, it was a 0-2 metagame day for people named Luis. It was not good.
For LSV's Luis Salvatto.
Yeah, exactly.
Not good at all. Before this gets any further out of hand, we will draw a veil over the proceedings of the morning. We will head towards the semi-finals. A reminder, about 10 minutes away, Ellen Bergeau, the Director of Global Organised Play, will be here to tell you all about changes to the Global Organised Play program. Meanwhile, it's time for the final part of Inside R&D. Don't you dare go away.
It's time now to delve deeper into the gameplay of Shadows over Innistrad. Let's take a look at the mechanics you'll be using to ward off the madness, solve the mystery, and avoid being killed by a flight of insane angels. Good luck with that. So double-faced cards make their return in Shadows over Innistrad. Now, these are cards with 2 faces and no back. So the front face has a mana cost, and that's the side that you cast. When it enters the battlefield, it does so front face up. Now, they all have an ability that will transform them. To transform it means to flip it over to its other face. Some cards have abilities on both sides that transform it, so you can go back and forth. For some, it's just a one-way trip.
Transformation here is a huge part of the story that we wanted to be telling. Double-faced cards are one of our best ways to show transformation. We also have a similar vein of transformation with Delirium, but yeah, in many ways, creating this transformation is a huge part of what we want gameplay to be about.
Double-faced cards just kind of give you that little bit of, it's like the perfect marriage between mechanics and story, where you can actually tell a story as the card flips, and the player gets a sense of like, oh, it was a nice, mild-mannered baker, and now he's a homicidal maniac. I get the story of what's going on in this world. So every time we get something like that happens, it's this sort of beautiful miracle, and it's why I love making Magic.
Well, the first time we made Innistrad, the double-faced cards were this really contentious thing. Like, a lot of my energy was trying to convince people, like, no, the audience will like them, I swear, these will be really cool. And so a lot of what we were doing the first time around was just trying to make sure we hit all the tropes. You know, it's Dr. Jekyll that turns into Mr. Hyde, it's the scientist that turns into the Fly, you know, it's the little girl that turns into the Exorcist. You know, we were trying to hit all the tropes. And so a lot of what double-faced cards was really saying, no, these are so cool, they're worth, you know, yeah, they're weird, but they're worth it.
One of my favorite double-faced cards in Shadows over Innistrad is the continuation of the character from the original Innistrad, which was Delver of Secrets, which on the other side became Insectile Aberration. And now we see Aberrant Researcher becomes Perfected Form. It's this story of the scientist that was so greedy for knowledge he was willing to test on himself. And we kind of see this progression from person into monster.
One of the things that we were trying to do, we were doing double-faced cards, is we said, okay, we want to explore and do things we've never done before. So Startled Awake and Persistent Nightmare is a good example of, like, this is not the kind of card you could normally make. Like, you need double-faced technology to do this. Like, it's a spell that becomes a creature that turns into a spell that makes a creature. Like, you know, it keeps going, and it's a really neat card, and it shows off, like, one of the things I believe as a designer is double-faced technology is deep. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it. And what you'll see in Shadows over Innistrad is we really start exploring more of that space.
So we knew Innistrad was going to be a graveyard set, so we need kind of a new flagship, strong, loud graveyard mechanic that wasn't flashback, which is what we did in the first Innistrad. So we spent a very long time, multiple iterations, coming up with something that felt like you're going mad, there was some insanity, you couldn't quite tell what's going on, you were losing your focus. So we had all sorts of iterations of what ended up as the Delirium mechanic.
Delirium is a new ability word found in Shadows over Innistrad, and it's on cards that get better if you have 4 or more card types among the cards in your graveyard. Now, what's a card type? Okay, the card types that can be in your graveyard are Artifact, Creature, Enchantment, Instant, Sorcery, Land, Planeswalker, and Tribal. What not to count is super types like basic or legendary, those don't count. And subtypes like equipment or human or zombie, those don't count either. You're just looking at card types. Now these Delirium abilities, there's all kinds of them. Some are triggered abilities, some are activated abilities. You gotta read each card pretty carefully to figure out what it does. But as soon as you load up your graveyard 4 more types, those cards get a lot better.
Delirium represents people going insane, specifically the players going insane. As you discard cards, as cards go from your library into your graveyard, as the creatures that are your loved ones die, you go more and more crazy. And in Innistrad, insanity brings with it great power. And so the Delirium mechanic represents losing all of these things and losing your marbles.
Delirium came up during the design team meetings because we were trying to find a way to make Threshold a little less deterministic. Threshold, it's, you know exactly how much time or how many cards you have to do to get from kind of 0 to 7.
Delirium has this interesting thing where you don't know how many cards it could be, and you can really shape your deck without playing a lot of enablers to make it work.
In order to make Delirium work, we needed to provide players with a lot of card types that they wouldn't otherwise put in limited decks. So we took effects that would normally be on instants and sorceries or on creatures and put them on enchantments. The Vessel Cycle is a great way to add card types to your deck without watering down a deck that you would want to play in limited. So like Vessel of Ephemera lets you make spirits, which is something that the Spirit deck wants to do. It's on a common, and it is an enchantment, so it feels magical, but it also contributes to Delirium, and that's why those cards exist.
In exploratory design, we had the task of, okay, the set is all about madness. What can we do? So one of the things we did is we said, well, let's go look at old mechanics, and like, is there any mechanic that really captures the sense of madness? And we said, you know, yeah, there is one. Madness!
Madness is a returning ability in Shadows over Innistrad. It came back because, I don't know, we're mad. So Madness on cards, what happens is, if you discard a card with Madness, you discard it, instead of going to your graveyard like normal, it goes to exile. Once that happens, an ability triggers. Once that ability resolves, you can cast the spell with Madness that you discarded to exile for its Madness cost instead of its mana cost. Now, you can't just discard a card because you feel like it. Something has to tell you to. There are lots of things in this set that will invite you to discard cards. Maybe your opponent casts a spell that makes you discard a card. The turn could end and you have 8 cards in your hand and you need to discard. It all works. You can cast these when you discard them. It's totally mad.
The most obvious thing is, oh, my opponent made me discard a card, I'm gonna get them, which is fine. But the real fun comes in when you have your own cards that, where you're discarding cards as part of a cost. And then all of a sudden, you're getting something for free almost. It's like, here's a free card, and usually it's cheaper than it normally would be. It just feels like you're cheating. I love feeling like I'm cheating when I'm playing Magic. I don't actually cheat, but I like to feel like I'm cheating.
Malevolent Whispers is a prime example of one of the cards that excites me with what we can do with Madness, especially from a limited perspective, where it's important to note that Madness lets you do things at timing where you wouldn't otherwise expect to be able to do it. So this card is a sorcery, and it's like Active Treason, which we have in many sets and is a very specific role. But if you have a way to discard this card when it's your opponent's turn, for example, like after they've attacked you, then you can end up using this more like Ray of Command, if you'll think back to cards long ago, where it actually allows you to take their creature, untap it, and block their, block one of their creatures with their own creature mid-combat, and it just gives a new functionality to a lot of these cards where you wouldn't expect to be able to play a creature mid-combat or a sorcery mid-combat, and it creates new dynamics.
Skulk is a new ability in Shadows over Innistrad on creatures that can't be blocked by any creature with greater power. Now, this is only checked once, as blockers are declared. Once a creature with Skulk is legally blocked by a creature with the same power or less, anything can happen. Giant growth can happen, whatever. The block is still legal.
We wanted to have a way for small creatures to remain relevant later in the game. A lot of the time in a limited or even constructed game, you have a small creature, it's useful in the early game, and then it becomes outclassed and just kind of sits there doing nothing. Skulk is a great way for small creatures to remain relevant both on attack and on defense in the later stages of the game.
So Skulk is an example of an ongoing design problem where you need to have these evasive mechanics so creatures can sometimes attack, sometimes block, and games can come to completion. Original Innistrad had Invisible Stalker, which is a loud example of a card that you can't interact with at all. So we're trying to look for things that are kind of in between unblockable, maybe in between hexproof, things that you might be able to stop or might not. So there's some back and forth to the game.
So we spent a lot of time in design figuring out how to capture the madness of the set. But also there was a mystery. The story is a mystery. So we wanted to make sure that we could capture the sense of mystery. Meanwhile, we also needed a card flow mechanic. So we're like, okay, we need mystery, we need a card flow mechanic. And so we started by actually picking a word, which was investigate. We really liked the word investigate. And said, okay, investigate seems like you're probably going to get cards. Cards are knowledge, you're seeking knowledge. And so we went down the path to try to figure out how to do that.
Shadows over Innistrad, of course, is all about mystery, so we've got a new keyword action called investigate. Now, when a card tells you to investigate, you put a clue token onto the battlefield. A clue token is an artifact. It has the ability to, and sacrifice it, to draw a card, so you can learn more about what's going on.
It's been awesome to see people starting to piece together clues, to do the puzzle rooms at the Grand Prix. to figure stuff out, and everything you figure out just raises more questions, and yes, this is exactly what we wanted you to do.
So Shadows over Innistrad has new mechanics, it has returning mechanics, it's got a bunch of awesome individual cards, and they all come together for this set that really puts players in control, gives them maximum choice and strategy, and they're going to have a blast with it.
There's no doubt that things have gone a little mad here on Innistrad, and the horror is far from over. Join us next time on Inside R&D when we go inside Eldritch Moon. But until we meet again, for all the people here at Wizards of the Coast, I'm your host, Rich Hagan, saying bye.